Hello, and welcome to the Midnight Library. I'm so glad you could join me tonight. Find a comfortable position, let the weight of the day settle and drift away. Allow your breathing to become slow and deep. Tonight's story is a quiet one, a gentle mystery about finding ourselves in the most unexpected of places. It's called The Mirror That Reflects Who You're Becoming. If you enjoy these peaceful journeys into the unknown, please consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell, so you never miss a chance to unwind with us. Now, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Alara lived her life in shades of sepia and parchment. Her small apartment, nestled above a quiet bakery, was a sanctuary of soft light and the gentle scent of aging paper. By trade, she was a restorer of old books, a profession that suited her temperament perfectly. She found solace in the meticulous, patient work of mending torn pages, re-stitching bindings, and coaxing the faded memories of a book back to life. Her days were a quiet rhythm of delicate tasks, the gentle tap of a brush applying paste, the soft whisper of a turning page, the low hum of the city filtered through her old, wavy window panes. Yet, lately, a subtle disquiet had begun to permeate her peaceful existence. It wasn't a loud unhappiness, but rather a muted sense of being a reflection of the books she mended, a well-preserved but static version of herself. With her own story feeling unwritten, her own pages yet to be filled with anything vibrant or new, she felt as though she was perpetually on the cusp of something. A chapter waiting to begin, but the ink remained dry in the well. One Tuesday, the sky wept a soft, persistent rain that washed the city in hues of gray and silver. It was the kind of day that usually encouraged Alara to stay inside, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of chamomile tea and a particularly fragile 19th century poetry collection. But an inexplicable restlessness pulled at her. She needed a specific type of marbled paper for a client's book, a swirling pattern of indigo and gold that she couldn't find at her usual suppliers. Donning her long raincoat, she decided to explore a part of the city she rarely visited, a winding labyrinth of cobbled lanes and forgotten storefronts that time seemed to have overlooked. The rain was a gentle companion, its rhythmic patter on her umbrella a soothing percussion to her solitary walk. The air smelled of wet stone and damp earth, a clean, ancient scent that cleared her mind. As she navigated the narrow streets, the modern world seemed to peel away, replaced by gas lamp-style streetlights and hand-painted signs that swung gently in the breeze. She felt like a character in one of her own books, stepping into a world between the lines of reality. It was on one such lane, so narrow that two umbrellas could not pass without a polite dance, that she found it. The shop had no name, only a small, tarnished brass plaque next to the door, engraved with a single, elegant symbol, an open eye within a circle. The window was filled not with a curated display, but with a beautiful, chaotic jumble of objects that seemed to be in quiet conversation with one another. A tarnished silver astrolabe rested against a stack of leather-bound journals. A collection of colored glass bottles caught the dim light like trapped jewels, and a wooden marionette with a thoughtful expression seemed to be observing the passers-by. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't truly indulged in years, finally won. With a soft chime of a small bell above the door, Alara pushed it open and stepped out of the rain, and into a pocket of silence and mystery. The air inside was thick with the complex, comforting aroma of beeswax, dried herbs, old wood, and something else, something indefinable, like the scent of slumbering dust and untold stories. It was a place where every object seemed to be waiting patiently for its next chapter, its next owner. And in the heart of this quiet clutter, leaning against a far wall, a faint gleam of silvered glass caught her eye, beckoning her deeper into the hushed and wondrous twilight of the forgotten shop. The shop's interior was a warm, dimly lit cavern of wonders. Shelves overflowed to the ceiling, crammed with artifacts that defied easy categorization. Globes of constellations long since renamed sat beside intricate clockwork mechanisms that had ceased their ticking centuries ago. The silence here was different from the silence in her apartment. It was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with the presence of all the lives these objects had touched. An elderly man with kind, crinkling eyes and a cascade of white hair emerged from behind a towering bookshelf. Moving with a slow, deliberate grace, he didn't speak, but simply offered her a gentle nod of welcome, his smile suggesting he had been expecting her. Or perhaps, he expected everyone eventually. He held a feather duster with the same reverence Alara held her bookbinding tools. He seemed less a shopkeeper and more a custodian of memories, a quiet guardian of forgotten histories. Alara returned the nod, feeling no pressure to browse or buy, but simply to exist within this space. She felt a profound sense of peace, the restlessness that had driven her out into the rain beginning to dissolve like sugar in warm tea. Her gaze was inevitably drawn back to the source of the gleam. It was a mirror, tall and oval, encased in a frame of what looked like darkened, almost black, wood. It was leaning against a tapestry depicting a moonlit forest, and the dim light of the shop seemed to pool and collect on its surface, giving it a soft, internal luminosity. As she drew closer, she saw that the frame was not merely dark wood, but a metal she didn't recognize, intricately carved with flowing, organic shapes. It wasn't the usual Baroque cherubs or ornate flowers she was used to seeing on antiques. Instead, the carvings depicted slender, intertwining branches of a willow tree, their leaves rendered with breathtaking delicacy. The branches flowed up both sides of the frame, meeting at the top in a crest that wasn't a crest at all, but two branches gently touching, as if in a quiet embrace. There were no sharp edges, no aggressive angles. Every line was a gentle curve, a soft sweep that invited the eye to follow its endless, peaceful journey. The craftsmanship was sublime, imbued with a sense of profound calm and natural grace. Alara ran a tentative finger along the cool, smooth surface of a carved leaf. There was a strange, subtle warmth to the metal, a faint vibration that hummed against her skin, almost like the purr of a contented cat. The glass itself was the most peculiar part. It wasn't perfect. It had the subtle waves and imperfections of old, hand-poured glass, but its reflective quality was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't sharp and cold like a modern mirror. The reflection it offered was softer, kinder, as if the glass had absorbed centuries of gentle candlelight and was now giving it back. Her own reflection looked different, less tired. The lines of worry around her eyes softened into faint traces of thoughtfulness. The shopkeeper approached, his footsteps making no sound on the old wooden floorboards. "It has been waiting a long time," he said, his voice a low, soothing whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves. "It doesn't show you what you are." "Not exactly. It's a bit shy. It prefers to show what the world is waiting to see in you." His words were cryptic, nonsensical even, but they resonated with a strange truth deep within her. She didn't understand what he meant, not with her logical mind, but her heart felt a flicker of recognition. She asked the price, expecting an astronomical sum. The old man simply smiled again. "For you," he said softly, "it is whatever you feel it is worth. It chooses its home, not the other way around." Carrying the mirror home was a surreal experience. The old shopkeeper had wrapped it carefully in soft, gray velvet cloth, and its weight was substantial, solid, and reassuring in her arms. The rain had softened to a fine, silvery mist, and the city lights blurred into soft orbs of gold and white as she walked back to her apartment. Each step felt deliberate, as though she were carrying not just an object, but a responsibility, a quiet promise. The usual hustle of the city seemed to be holding its breath around her, the sounds of traffic and people muted and distant. When she finally reached her building, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery below felt like a warm welcome. She navigated the familiar creaks of the wooden staircase, her heart beating with a gentle, unaccustomed anticipation. Unwrapping the mirror in the soft light of her living room was like unveiling a secret. The dark, willow-carved frame seemed to absorb the light, while the glass itself gave it back with a pearlescent glow. It looked perfect, as if a missing piece of her home, a piece she never knew she needed, had finally been found. She spent the next hour deciding where it should lie. It didn't feel right in the hallway, where reflections would be fleeting glances. It felt too intimate for the main living area, where the light was often too bright and direct. Finally, she chose a quiet corner of her bedroom, opposite a window that looked out over a small, shared garden. Here, the light was always soft and indirect, filtered through the leaves of a climbing rose that clung to the brick wall outside. She leaned it against the wall, adjusting its angle until it seemed to settle with a sigh of contentment. It reflected the window, the climbing rose, and a sliver of the ever-changing sky. It brought the outside world into her room in a gentle, poetic way. Then, she did what one does with a new mirror. She looked at herself. The reflection was still soft, still kind. The Alara in the mirror seemed to have a stillness about her, a quiet self-possession that the real Alara felt she lacked. She saw the familiar tangle of her brown hair, the smudges of ink on her fingers, the comfortable wear of her favorite sweater. But there was something else, too, a depth in her eyes, a subtle lift at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but the promise of one. She dismissed it as a trick of the old glass, the soft light, her own hopeful imagination. She cleaned the glass with a soft, lint-free cloth, and as she polished the surface, a sense of profound tranquility washed over her. The act was meditative, rhythmic. The mirror felt like an old friend, a silent confidant. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, casting long, peaceful shadows across her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the mirror again. The sky outside was a deepening velvet blue, and the mirror reflected it perfectly, but seemed to add a few extra, imaginary stars to the view. She watched her own reflection as the light faded. The woman looking back at her seemed to be listening intently, not to the sounds of the apartment or the city, but to something far away, something internal. Alara felt a strange sense of connection to this version of herself. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a static page in a forgotten book. She felt like a story that was just beginning, and the mirror was the frontispiece, an illustration hinting at the wonder and mystery to come. As she drifted to sleep that night, the gentle scent of rain and old wood seemed to linger in the air. A peaceful reminder of the day she found the quiet shop and the mirror that was so much more than just glass and wood. The first few days with the mirror were a study in subtlety. Alara would catch glimpses of her reflection as she moved about her room, dressing for the day or preparing for bed. Each time, she felt that same quiet jolt of unrecognition. It wasn't a different person looking back at her, but rather, herself viewed through a filter of potential. The Alara in the mirror held her shoulders a little straighter. Her movements seemed more fluid, less hesitant. It was as if the mirror was smoothing out the rough edges of her self-doubt, presenting an idealized yet attainable version of who she could be. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the slight curve of the old glass was creating a subtle distortion. Perhaps the way the light fell in that particular corner of her room was uniquely flattering. Her logical mind, the part of her that could identify the precise era of a book by its binding technique, searched for a concrete explanation. Yet, the part of her that understood the soul of a poem knew that this was something beyond simple optics. The feeling it gave her was too profound, too specific, to be a mere trick of the light. The first truly inexplicable event happened on a Thursday morning. Alara was working on a particularly challenging restoration, a botanical encyclopedia from the late 18th century. The illustrations were exquisite, but the colors had faded over the centuries, and a water stain had blurred a page depicting a night blooming cereus. A flower known for its ethereal, transient beauty, she was mixing watercolors, trying to match the delicate, ghostly white of the petals and the soft, mossy green of the leaves. She felt frustrated, a block in her creativity. The colors she mixed felt flat, lifeless. She felt she was failing the original artist, failing the flower itself. Sighing, she stood up to stretch and glanced towards the mirror. For a fleeting second, the reflection was startlingly different. The Alara in the glass was also standing. But in her hand, she held a paintbrush dipped in a color Alara had not mixed. It was a luminous, silvery white, a shade that seemed to shimmer with its own internal moonlight. The perfect, otherworldly color of the cereus bloom. And in her reflection's eyes, there was not frustration, but a look of intense, joyful focus. She was not struggling, she was creating, channeling the flower's essence onto the page. The vision lasted no longer than a heartbeat. When she blinked, her reflection was normal again, mirroring her own surprised and confused expression. But the image of that color, that perfect, moonlit white, was burned into her mind. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating sense of discovery. She walked back to her workbench, her mind racing. She looked at her palette of mundane whites, titanium, zinc, chalky off-white. None of them were right. Then, acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she took a tiny dab of her standard white and mixed in a minuscule speck of pearlescent silver she usually reserved for illuminating manuscripts. And a whisper of pale blue. She held her breath and applied the new color to a scrap of paper. It was perfect. It was the color from the mirror. It shimmered with a soft, living light, capturing the very spirit of the nocturnal flower. She worked for the rest of the day in a state of flow. The creative block completely gone, replaced by a quiet, confident energy. As she meticulously restored the illustration, she felt as if she were being guided by a gentle, unseen hand. That night, before she turned off the light, she stood before the mirror and whispered a soft, "Thank you," into the quiet of her room. The reflection staring back seemed to smile, a knowing, encouraging smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The mirror's influence began to seep into other areas of Alara's life. Always in gentle, almost imperceptible ways. It never showed her anything dramatic or impossible. It didn't reflect a future of fame or fortune. Instead, it revealed small, potent possibilities, seeds of a self she had long forgotten she carried within her. One evening, as she sat reading, a profound silence filled her apartment. The usual city sounds were muffled by a fresh blanket of snow that had fallen throughout the day, insulating her world in a soft, white peace. The only sound was the rustle of the page and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a comfortable silence, but also an empty one. She found herself humming a tune, a fragment of a melody she couldn't place. It was a simple, melancholic air that felt both strange and deeply familiar. She tried to follow the thread of the song in her memory, but it always slipped away, leaving her with a lingering sense of loss for something she couldn't name. Later, as she passed the mirror on her way to make tea, she paused. Her reflection was sitting on the edge of her bed, but her posture was different. In the reflection, her hands were not resting in her lap, they were gracefully poised in the air, her fingers moving as if playing an invisible instrument. Her expression was one of deep concentration and profound emotion. Her head tilted slightly as if listening to music that Alara couldn't hear. Alara stared, mesmerized. She watched the phantom fingers dance, pressing down on phantom keys, her reflection's body swaying gently with the rhythm of the silent song. And then she recognized it. The movements, the melody that now flooded her mind with perfect clarity. It was the lullaby her grandmother used to play for her on the old, upright piano that had sat in their living room. A piano that had been sold decades ago after her grandmother passed. Alara had taken a few lessons as a child but had given up. Convinced she had no talent, she had forgotten all about it, burying the memory under years of practicality and self-doubt. The vision in the mirror faded, leaving Alara standing alone in the silent room, the ghost of the melody still echoing in her ears. A wave of nostalgia and a deep, unexpected sadness washed over her. She had loved that music. She had loved the way her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and gentle, could pull such beauty from the ivory keys. The next day, guided by an impulse she didn't try to understand, Alara found herself in a small, dusty music shop a few blocks from her apartment. She had no intention of buying anything, she just wanted to be near pianos, to smell the polished wood and feel the history in the room. In a forgotten corner, there was a small, second-hand keyboard with weighted keys. It was nothing like her grandmother's grand piano, but when she tentatively sat down and placed her fingers on the keys, they seemed to find their place instinctively, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence. Her fingers began to play. The melody from the mirror, her grandmother's lullaby, filled the quiet shop. It was clumsy, full of mistakes, but it was there. The song was alive again, not just in her memory, but in the world. The shop owner, an elderly woman with a kind face, simply smiled from behind the counter, polishing a violin and letting the music unfold. Alara played until her fingers ached, a quiet joy blooming in her chest, a joy that felt like coming home. The mirror hadn't shown her a concert pianist, it had simply reminded her of a love she had forgotten. A small, personal piece of her own story waiting to be reclaimed. Alara had always considered herself a person of few words. In social situations, she often felt like a spectator, listening to the vibrant tapestry of conversations around her but never quite knowing how to weave her own thread into the design. Her voice, when she did speak, often felt small and uncertain, as if it were apologizing for taking up space in the air. Her work was solitary, her hobbies were quiet, and her interactions were mostly limited to polite, brief exchanges with clients or the baker downstairs. She had accepted this as a fundamental part of her personality. She was a listener, not a talker, an observer, not a participant. She had convinced herself that she didn't have much of importance to say anyway. Her thoughts were her own, best kept safe and sound within the quiet library of her mind. This belief had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, building silent walls around her that had grown higher and thicker with each passing year. One afternoon, she was preparing for a phone call with a new, important client, a collector who wanted her to restore a rare first edition. She rehearsed her professional greeting, her explanation of the restoration process, her answers to potential questions. Her stomach was in a familiar knot of anxiety. She worried she would stammer, or sound unprofessional, or that her knowledge would somehow fail her under pressure. As she paced her small living room, her script memorized, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The image it showed her was arresting. The Alara in the mirror was not pacing anxiously. She was sitting calmly in a comfortable armchair, a book open in her lap. She wasn't alone. Opposite her, in a chair that didn't exist in Alara's room, sat the faint, translucent outline of another person. And the reflection of Alara was speaking. Alara couldn't hear the words, but she could see them in the confident, easy way her reflection's mouth moved. She was gesturing with one hand, not wildly, but with a quiet emphasis that spoke of passion and knowledge. Her expression was animated, engaged, and her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. She wasn't just talking, she was sharing a story, explaining a concept with a clarity and warmth that was utterly foreign to Alara. She was captivating. The vision was so compelling that Alara stopped pacing and simply watched. Fascinated, this version of her was not loud or overbearing, she was simply present. She was occupying her space, sharing her thoughts, without apology or hesitation. The translucent figure seemed to be listening intently, nodding along, The phone on her desk rang, jolting her out of the reverie. The vision vanished. For a moment, she was tempted to let it go to voicemail, to retreat back into her shell of silence. But the image of the confident woman in the mirror lingered in her mind. Taking a deep breath, Alara walked to the desk and picked up the receiver. She didn't use her rehearsed script. Instead, channeling the calm assurance she had just witnessed, she simply began to speak. She talked about the book, not just its physical condition, but its history, the story of its printing, the beauty of its prose. Her voice didn't waver. Words she didn't know she had came easily, painting a vivid picture for the client on the other end of the line. The conversation flowed naturally, evolving from a simple business call into a shared appreciation for literature. When she hung up, the knot in her stomach was gone, replaced by a warm, glowing sense of accomplishment. She had not pretended to be someone else. The mirror had simply shown her a truth she had refused to believe, that her voice was worth hearing, and her stories were worth telling. Alara's apartment was a haven of indoor comforts, but it lacked a connection to the living, breathing world of nature. Her window looked out onto a shared garden, a patch of green she often admired from a distance but never felt a part of. She appreciated the beauty of the climbing rose, the resilience of the weeds that grew between the paving stones. But she saw herself as separate from it. She was a creature of paper and ink, of controlled indoor environments. The world of soil, roots, and unpredictable growth felt alien to her. She believed she lacked the green thumb, the innate intuition required to nurture a living plant. Any small succulent or herb pot she had ever been gifted had invariably withered under her well-intentioned but inexpert care. So, she had resigned herself to admiring nature through the glass of her window. Like a visitor at an aquarium, close but never truly connected, she was a curator of things that had once lived, the wood pulp of paper, the leather of a binding, but not of things that were still growing. This feeling of separation was challenged one rainy Sunday. The world outside was a watercolor painting of soft grays and deep greens. Alara was feeling particularly melancholic, the quiet patter of the rain mirroring a sense of stagnation she felt within herself. She glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see a reflection of her own somber mood. But the mirror offered something else entirely. In the glass, her room was subtly transformed. The corner where the mirror stood was bathed in a soft, verdant light. On the windowsill, which in reality was bare, a row of small terracotta pots bloomed with life. There were delicate ferns unfurling their fronds, a cascade of ivy with heart-shaped leaves, and in the center, a single, perfect gardenia with waxy white petals. Her reflection was tending to these plants. Her fingers, usually stained with ink, now dusted with rich, dark soil. She was misting the leaves with a small spray bottle, her movements gentle and assured. The look on her face was one of serene contentment, a deep, quiet joy that seemed to stem directly from this connection with the living green things around her. The image was so vivid, so peaceful, that Alara felt a pang of longing. She wanted that feeling. She wanted that connection. The vision faded, leaving her with the image of the vibrant green life imprinted on her mind. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. On her way home from buying groceries, she found herself hesitating outside a small flower shop she passed every day. Guided by the memory in the mirror, she walked inside. The humid air, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, was a welcome embrace. She didn't know where to start. The sheer variety was overwhelming. But then she saw a small, resilient-looking fern, its leaves the exact shade of green as the one in her vision. She bought it, along with a simple terracotta pot and a small bag of soil. Back in her apartment, she felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. What if she killed it? But then she recalled the gentle, confident movements of her reflection. She mimicked them, carefully filling the pot, nestling the fern's roots into the soil. giving it a small drink of water. She placed it on the windowsill, in the exact spot where she had seen it in the mirror. It was just one small plant, but it changed the entire feeling of the room. It was a small splash of vibrant, unpredictable life in her world of quiet order. It was a promise of growth, a living, breathing thing that depended on her. And as she looked from the small fern to its reflection in the mirror, she saw that the woman looking back at her was already smiling. The years had created a quiet chasm between Alara and the few friends she had made in her youth. Life, as it often does, had pulled them in different directions. Careers, relationships, and the simple, demanding rhythm of adult life had turned weekly calls into monthly texts, and monthly texts into occasional holiday greetings. One person she missed more than any other was a woman named Clara, her closest friend from university. They had shared a love for old movies, rainy afternoons, and long, meandering conversations that lasted late into the night. Clara was everything Alara was not: bold, spontaneous, and effortlessly social. She had been the one who gently coaxed Alara out of her shell, who saw the quiet strength and wit beneath her reserved exterior. But a move to a different city and the slow, insidious drift of time had eroded their connection. The silence between them had grown so vast that reaching out felt like shouting across a canyon. And Alara, ever quiet, couldn't bring herself to raise her voice. The fear of an awkward, stilted conversation, or worse, no reply at all, kept her from trying. One evening, while organizing a box of old photographs, she came across a picture of herself and Clara, laughing, arms slung around each other's shoulders, standing in front of an old, independent cinema. The memory was so vivid, so full of warmth and uncomplicated happiness, that it brought a sharp ache to her chest. She placed the photograph on her nightstand, and later, as she looked into her willow-framed mirror, her thoughts were full of her lost friendship. The reflection that greeted her was one of the most poignant yet. It showed Alara sitting on her sofa, a warm blanket draped over her legs. She was holding her phone to her ear, and her face was illuminated by a genuine, unreserved smile. She was laughing, a silent, joyful laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. The expression was one of pure, unadulterated connection. It was the face of someone listening to a cherished, familiar voice, someone bridging a long silence not with awkwardness, but with the easy, immediate comfort of a shared history. She knew, with absolute certainty, that her reflection was talking to Clara. The image stayed with her, a powerful testament to a bond that she had allowed to go dormant but had not truly broken. The fear was still there, a cold knot of apprehension in her stomach, but the vision in the mirror had offered a powerful counter-narrative. It didn't show the awkward beginning of the call, it showed the joyful result. For 2 more days, Alara hesitated. She would pick up her phone, find Clara's number in her contacts, and then lose her nerve. Each time, she would glance at the mirror, and while the specific vision didn't return, her own reflection seemed to hold a quiet, patient encouragement in its gaze. Finally, on the 3rd day, she took a deep breath and pressed the call button before she could change her mind. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. She was about to hang up, a wave of relief and disappointment washing over her, when a voice answered. "Alara, is that really you?" Clara's voice was exactly the same, warm, and full of surprise and unmistakable pleasure. The awkwardness Alara had feared melted away in an instant. They talked for over an hour, the years of silence dissolving as if they had never been. They laughed, they reminisced, they caught each other up on the big and small events of their lives. When they hung up, with a promise to talk again soon, Alara caught sight of herself in the mirror. She was smiling, her eyes shining, her face glowing with the same joyful connection she had seen in her reflection. The mirror hadn't made the call for her, but it had shown her the warmth that was waiting on the other side of her fear. Alara's world, both professional and personal, was steeped in the past. Her hands were most comfortable with things that had already lived their primary life, books that had been read by generations, bindings that had been worn smooth by countless hands. Her own creativity was channeled into preservation, not origination. She was a master at recreating, at matching the old with the new so seamlessly that her work was invisible. The idea of creating something entirely her own, something born from her own imagination, was a terrifyingly blank page. Where would she even begin? What story could she possibly tell that hadn't been told better by the authors whose books she so lovingly repaired? This belief had become a cage, comfortable and safe, but a cage nonetheless. She admired artistry from a distance, convinced it was a language she could appreciate but never speak herself. This conviction was gently challenged on a quiet Saturday. She had spent the morning finishing a complex restoration, and her apartment was filled with the familiar, comforting smells of her trade: old paper, leather, and the subtle almond scent of bookbinding glue. As she cleaned her workspace, she glanced at the mirror. The image was hazy at first, as if viewed through a soft focus lens. Then, it sharpened with breathtaking clarity. The Alara in the reflection was not at her restoration table. She was standing at a heavy wooden workbench that Alara did not own. In a room filled with a warm, golden light, her hands were not restoring, they were creating. She was holding a small, exquisitely bound book, no bigger than the palm of her hand. The cover was not old leather, but a deep, vibrant blue velvet, and embroidered on it in silver thread was a delicate, intricate spiral, like a galaxy or a nautilus shell. The book was entirely of her own making. But it wasn't just the book that was different. It was what she was doing. She lifted the cover of the miniature book to her nose and inhaled deeply, a look of serene satisfaction on her face. Then, with a delicate glass dropper, she placed a single, golden drop of liquid onto a small piece of blotter paper tucked within the pages. Alara stared, utterly perplexed. What was her reflection doing? It was an artist, a bookbinder, and a perfumer? The idea was so alien, so far removed from her own reality, that she almost laughed, and yet, she couldn't look away. The reflection's movements were filled with a quiet passion, a fusion of two crafts she had never thought to combine. The vision faded, but the concept lingered, a strange and beautiful seed planted in her mind. A book that you didn't just read, but that you experienced through scent, a story told in paper, thread, and fragrance. The idea was intoxicating. It refused to leave her. For the rest of the day, she found her mind wandering, imagining what stories would smell like. An old library would smell of vanilla, leather, and dust. A ghost story might smell of cold stone, damp earth, and ozone. A romance could smell of rosé, parchment, and a hint of spice. The possibilities were endless, a whole new dimension of storytelling opening up before her. The next week, she didn't just visit her usual art supply store. She also found her way to a small, quiet shop that sold essential oils. Her heart thrumming with a nervous, excited energy, she bought small vials of sandalwood, lavender, cedar, and bergamot, not knowing what she would do with them, only knowing that she had to. The mirror hadn't given her a new skill, but it had given her a new idea, a beautiful, strange, and wonderfully original idea that was entirely her own to explore. For Alara, comfort was found in stillness. Her work required a steady hand and immense patience. Her hobbies, reading, listening to music, tending to her single fern, were all quiet, sedentary activities. She moved through her life with a careful, deliberate slowness, as if trying not to disturb the delicate balance of her own tranquility. The idea of loud, expressive movement was foreign to her. She had always avoided dancing, even at weddings or parties, feeling clumsy and self-conscious, a tangle of awkward limbs. She believed her body was a vessel for her mind in her hands, a practical tool, not an instrument of joy or expression. She saw grace and beauty in the movements of others, but never in herself. The world of rhythm and motion was a party to which she was certain she would never be invited. Content to watch from the doorway. This quiet acceptance was disrupted by a simple, unexpected sound. One evening, while washing dishes, a piece of music came on the small radio she kept in her kitchen. It was an instrumental piece, a soaring, melancholic cello melody backed by a lively, intricate piano arrangement. The music was beautiful, filled with a bittersweet longing that resonated deep within her. She stopped what she was doing, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water, and simply listened, her eyes closed. The music seemed to fill every corner of her small apartment, every corner of her soul. She felt an unfamiliar urge, a twitch in her muscles, a desire to move, to physically respond to the beauty of the sound. She suppressed it, of course. The feeling was too strange, too bold, but the music lingered long after the song had ended. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, the cello melody still swirling in her mind, she stood before the mirror. Her reflection stood there, as usual, but as Alara watched, it began to move, softly, tentatively at first. The reflection began to sway to the unheard music. Its arms, which Alara always held so stiffly at her sides, lifted in a graceful arc. It took a slow, gliding step, then another. The reflection began to dance. It was not a wild, exuberant dance, but a slow, deeply personal and expressive waltz with an unseen partner. The movements were fluid, full of a quiet, confident grace she could never imagine possessing. Her reflection's eyes were closed, a soft, serene smile on her face, completely lost in the motion and the music. She was not performing for anyone, she was simply expressing the melody with her body, turning the sound into a physical form. Alara watched, her breath caught in her throat. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The dance was filled with all the longing and hope of the cello. A perfect, physical translation of the music. When the phantom song ended, the reflection stood still, its chest rising and falling gently, its face glowing. The vision disappeared, leaving Alara alone in the silence, her own body rigid and unmoving. But something inside her had shifted. The following evening, she put on the same piece of music. She stood in the center of her living room, her heart pounding. She felt foolish, but then she closed her eyes, remembering the serene face of her reflection. She took a deep breath, and she began to move. It was clumsy, hesitant, nothing like the fluid grace she had seen in the mirror. But she wasn't trying to replicate it. She was just letting the music guide her. She swayed, she turned, she lifted her arms. She was dancing, alone in her apartment, with only the moon as a witness. Alara danced with her own shadow. And for the first time, she felt truly, completely free in her own skin. Alara's daily routine was a carefully constructed fortress designed to minimize unexpected interactions. She went to the same coffee shop at the same off-peak hour, where the barista knew her order and they could complete the transaction with a few familiar nods and smiles. She took the same quiet side streets on her walks, avoiding the bustling main avenues. She preferred the predictable solitude of her apartment to the chaotic, unpredictable energy of the city. Strangers were question marks, potential sources of awkwardness or misunderstanding. She wasn't unkind, she was simply shy. And over the years, that shyness had calcified into a habit of invisibility. She moved through the city like a ghost, her gaze directed downwards, her presence quiet and unassuming, leaving no ripple in the pond of public life. This was her comfort zone, a small, safe harbor in a vast, overwhelming sea of people. One rainy afternoon, as she was rushing home, her umbrella caught by a sudden gust of wind, she saw a small, independent bookstore she had never noticed before. A sign in the window announced a poetry reading that evening. Her first instinct was to hurry past, to dismiss it, a public gathering, full of strangers, was the very definition of her discomfort. But a small part of her, a part that had been growing bolder these past few weeks, was intrigued. The featured poet was unknown to her, but the title of their collection, Whispers from the Margins, resonated with her own quiet existence. She thought about it for the rest of the day. The idea, a small, flickering candle in the back of her mind. She would never actually go, of course, but it was nice to imagine. That evening, as she was settling in with a book, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The image was, at first, unremarkable. It was just her, sitting and reading. But then she noticed the background. It wasn't her apartment. It was a cozy, warmly lit room, with rows of books and a small, makeshift stage. It was the bookstore. Her reflection was at the poetry reading. She was not hiding in the back, but sitting in the second row, her posture relaxed and open. And she was not looking at the stage, but at the person sitting next to her, a faint, indistinct figure. Her reflection was smiling, a soft, gentle smile, and then she nodded, as if in agreement with something the person had said. It was a small, simple moment of connection, a shared glance, a silent understanding between two strangers brought together by a love of words. There was no anxiety in her reflection's face, no awkwardness. There was only a quiet, comfortable sense of belonging. The vision was so peaceful, so attainable, that it seemed to disarm Alara's own deep-seated fears. It wasn't a vision of her becoming the life of the party. It was a vision of her simply being a part of the quiet life of the city. It was a vision of connection, not performance. An hour later, with her heart beating a nervous but steady rhythm, Alara put on her raincoat, pulled her scarf tight, and walked out of her apartment. She walked the few blocks to the little bookstore and, taking a deep breath, stepped inside. The room was warm and smelled of paper and coffee. She found a seat in the back, her courage failing her slightly. But as the poet began to read, the beautiful, quiet words filling the room, she felt her anxiety begin to melt away. She was not a stranger here. She was a listener, just like everyone else. During a small break, the elderly woman sitting next to her leaned over and whispered, "Isn't that a lovely line about the rain?" Alara looked at her, and remembering the gentle smile in the mirror, she smiled back and said, "Yes, it is." It was a small moment, a tiny thread of connection, but it was real, and it was enough. Weeks turned into months, and Alara's life had subtly but profoundly transformed. Her apartment was now home to a small family of thriving plants. She spoke to Clara on the phone every Sunday. She had started a new, personal project, a small, beautifully bound book of her own poetry, and she was experimenting with infusing the pages with the scent of lavender and old paper. She had even attended another poetry reading, and had a short but pleasant conversation about a mutual favorite author. Each of these changes was a small stone dropped into the quiet pool of her life, and the ripples were spreading outwards, creating new patterns of confidence and connection. She was becoming the woman in the mirror, and the process was so gentle, so organic, that she barely noticed the magnitude of the shift until she looked back. She felt a deep, abiding gratitude for the strange, magical object that had become her silent guide. But with this gratitude, a new, unsettling question began to form in her mind. Who was she? Without the mirror? Was this new confidence truly hers? Or was it borrowed from the reflection? Was she the artist? Or was she simply copying a beautiful picture she had been shown? A thread of doubt, fine as a spider's silk but surprisingly strong, began to weave itself into her thoughts. She started to rely on the mirror, glancing at it before any new undertaking, seeking its silent approval or guidance. If she was facing a difficult decision, she would stand before it, hoping for a vision to show her the way. The mirror, which had started as a source of gentle encouragement, was threatening to become a crutch. The mystery was no longer about what the mirror would show her, but about what part of her was real, and what part was merely a reflection. This quiet, internal conflict came to a head one afternoon. She received an invitation to submit some of her restoration work to a prestigious artisan guild's exhibition. It was a huge honor, a recognition of her skill that she had never dreamed of. But the application also had an optional category for original works. She immediately thought of her scented book of poetry. It was her most personal, most cherished creation, but the thought of putting it out into the world, to be judged, was terrifying. She went to the mirror, her heart filled with a mix of hope and fear. Seeking an answer, she stood before it, asking the silent glass, "What should I do?" She waited for a vision. She expected to see her reflection confidently filling out the application, or perhaps a vision of her book displayed beautifully in a gallery. But the mirror showed her nothing. It simply reflected her own anxious, uncertain face. There was no magic, no hint of the future, no gentle nudge in the right direction. The glass was quiet, impassive. She stared for a long time, her own reflection staring back, and a slow, profound realization began to dawn on her. The mirror was not a fortune teller. It was not a magical instruction manual for her life. It had never told her what to do. It had only ever shown her what she was capable of. It reflected not a predetermined future, but the potential that was already lying dormant within her. The confidence, the creativity, the courage, they had not come from the mirror, but from her. The mirror had simply been the catalyst, the quiet friend who believed in her before she could believe in herself. The decision to submit her work, she now understood, had to be hers and hers alone. The mirror's silence was a more profound message than any vision it had ever offered. It was a quiet, respectful step back, a gesture that said, "You are ready now. You don't need me anymore." Alara stood in her room, the application for the Artisan Guild lying on her desk, the choice laid bare before her. For a moment, a wave of panic washed over her. The safety net was gone. For months, she had been walking a tightrope, but she had always known the mirror was there to catch her. Now, she was on her own. The fear of failure, of judgment, of putting her most vulnerable, creative self on display for the world to see, felt immense. It would be so easy to retreat, to stick to the safe, familiar world of restoration. No one would blame her, no one but herself. She looked around her room, at the small changes that had become so much a part of her life. She saw the vibrant green leaves of the fern on her windowsill, a testament to her newfound ability to nurture. She saw the photograph of her and Clara, a symbol of a rekindled connection. She smelled the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood and lavender from her experimental book, a fragrance of her own creation. These were not the accomplishments of a reflection. They were hers. She had potted the fern. She had made the call. She had written the poems and blended the scents. The mirror had been a map, but she had been the one to walk the path, to take the steps, to climb the hills. The strength she felt was not borrowed. It had been forged in the small acts of courage she had undertaken every day. She walked over to her desk and picked up her little book of scented poetry. It was small, imperfect, and intensely personal. The cover was the deep blue velvet she had seen in her vision. But the embroidered spiral was her own design, slightly uneven but full of character. The pages inside held her quietest thoughts, her most secret hopes, written in her own neat, careful script. It was a tangible piece of her soul. Holding it in her hands, she understood that the real risk was not in sharing it and being rejected, but in keeping it hidden and never knowing. The empty page she had once feared was not a void, but an invitation, an opportunity. With a steady hand, she sat down at her desk. She filled out the application, her penmanship clear and confident. When she came to the section for original works, she did not hesitate. She wrote down the title she had given her small creation, an atlas of quiet things. She carefully packaged the book, wrapping it in soft tissue paper and placing it in a sturdy box. The entire process felt calm, deliberate, And right, it wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture, but a quiet, firm step into the person she had been becoming all along. After she had sealed the package, she walked back to the mirror. She looked at her reflection, at the woman with the calm eyes and the gentle, self-assured set of her mouth. There was no magic in the glass now, only the truth. She saw a woman who was no longer just a restorer of old stories, but a writer of new ones. A woman who had learned that her own voice, her own art, her own quiet presence in the world, was worthy. She raised a hand and gently touched the cool surface of the glass. A silent gesture of farewell and of profound thanks. The journey wasn't over, but she no longer needed a map to show her the way. She was ready to navigate by her own stars. A few weeks after she sent her application, a sense of peaceful anticipation settled over Alara. She no longer looked to the willow-framed mirror for guidance. Their conversation, it seemed, had come to a natural and satisfying conclusion. The mirror was still a beautiful object, a cherished part of her room, but its role had changed. It was no longer a magical portal to her potential, but a quiet reminder of the journey she had undertaken. It was like a treasured letter from an old friend, one whose words you have long since memorized but whose physical presence you keep for the comfort it brings. Her days continued in their new, richer rhythm. She worked on her restorations with a renewed sense of purpose, seeing the artistry and history in each volume with clearer eyes. But now, she also dedicated time to her own creations, filling a new notebook with poems and ideas for other sensory books. Her small apartment felt more alive than ever, filled with the scent of growing things, the sound of her quiet humming as she played a melody on her small keyboard, and the vibrant energy of a life being fully lived. One morning, the post arrived, and with it, a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed seal of the Artisan Guild. Her heart gave a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was a milder, more manageable feeling than it would have been in the past. It was the nervousness of hope, not the paralysis of fear. She made herself a cup of tea, her hands steady, and sat down in her favorite armchair before carefully opening the letter. The formal language of the letter informed her that her restoration work had been accepted for the exhibition, a significant honor in itself. She smiled, a quiet sense of pride warming her. Then, her eyes scanned down the page to the paragraph about the original works category. It stated that while the category had been incredibly competitive, the judges had been uniquely captivated by the innovative and deeply personal nature of An Atlas of Quiet Things. Her book had been accepted. It would be displayed in the gallery. A slow, radiant joy spread through her, a warmth that started in her chest and reached to the tips of her fingers. It was a feeling of pure, unadulterated validation, not from the judges, but from herself. It was the confirmation that her voice, the one she had thought so small and insignificant, had been heard. She didn't shout or jump for joy. Her reaction was as quiet and deep as she was. She simply sat there for a long time, the letter in her lap, a single, happy tear tracing a path down her cheek. Later that day, she was in the bathroom, washing the ink from her hands, when she happened to glance up at her own reflection in the simple, plain-edged bathroom mirror. It was a normal mirror, a functional piece of glass with no magic, no history, no ornate carvings, and the woman who looked back at her stopped her in her tracks. She saw a woman with bright, clear eyes, full of a quiet confidence. She saw a faint, contented smile playing on her lips. She saw someone whose posture was straight and whose presence was calm and assured. It was the woman from the willow-framed mirror. The ideal, the potential, the person she was becoming. She was here. She was no longer just a flicker in a magical piece of glass. She was real, reflected in the most ordinary of surfaces. In that moment, Alara understood the mirror's final, most important lesson. The magic had never been in the silvered glass or the carved wooden frame. It had been in her all along. The mirror was not a creator, it was a revealer. It hadn't given her anything she didn't already possess. It had simply held up a reflection of her own forgotten courage, her own dormant creativity, her own quiet strength, until she was finally able to see it for herself. The night of the exhibition opening was crisp and clear, the city sky dotted with 1,000 distant stars. Alara walked to the gallery, her steps light and even on the pavement. She was not the anxious, hesitant woman who had hidden from the world just a few months ago. She felt a quiet excitement, a sense of belonging. The gallery was filled with soft light, murmured conversations, and the clinking of glasses. Beautiful objects were displayed with reverence, intricate woodwork, delicate ceramics, stunning textiles, a celebration of human creativity and skill. In a quiet, well-lit alcove, she found her display. Her restoration of the 18th century botanical encyclopedia was there, open to the page of the Night Blooming Cereus, its colors vibrant and alive. And next to it, on a small, velvet-covered pedestal, sat an atlas of quiet things. Her small, handmade book looked perfectly at home amongst the other works of art. It was not grand or imposing, but it had a presence, a quiet dignity that drew people in. As she watched from a small distance, she saw people approach it. They would lean in, intrigued by its small size and the delicate embroidery. They would read the small card that explained its concept. And then, with a look of surprise and delight, they would follow the instruction to lift the cover and gently inhale. She saw their expressions change as they discovered the scent of lavender and old paper. She saw them smile, a slow, thoughtful smile, as they connected with her art on a level beyond the visual. They were experiencing her poetry, her quiet world, in the most intimate way. A young woman who had been looking at the book turned and caught Alara's eye. "This is yours, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft. "It's beautiful. It feels peaceful." Alara smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "Thank you," she said. "That's what I was hoping for." They fell into a comfortable conversation, not just about the book, but about poetry, and the city, and the beauty of quiet things. Later that evening, Alara stepped out onto a small balcony to look at the night sky. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of rightness. The woman in the mirror had not been a destination she had to arrive at. She was a journey, an unfolding, a constant process of becoming. The mirror had simply opened a door, and it had been up to her to find the courage to step through it. She knew there would still be days of doubt, moments of hesitation, but she also knew that she now possessed her own internal compass, her own source of light. She didn't need the magic mirror anymore, because she had learned to see the magic in herself. As she headed home through the quiet, sleeping streets, she passed by the narrow, forgotten lane where she had first found the antique shop. On an impulse, she walked down it. The shop was dark, the windows empty, the tarnished brass plaque with the eye in the circle was gone. It was as if the shop had never been there at all. A dream that had vanished with the morning light. Alara wasn't surprised. She simply smiled to herself. A quiet thank you whispered to the night air. The shop had served its purpose. And now, her own story, vibrant and full of possibility, was just beginning. She walked back to her apartment, where her quiet, wonderful life was waiting, ready to write the next page.